Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Moments That Define Us. Today, we have a very special guest. And before this recording, I was thinking how social media can be really great in the situation I am today. Because, when we started our podcast, we were looking for all different kinds of podcasts just to see what they talk about, who is the host of the podcast. And I came across the podcast of the guest we have today. And before I reach out to her, I listened to a few episodes, and they were very interesting because she talks about topics that a lot of the times makes some people maybe uncomfortable, maybe they don't want to talk about it. So I was very grateful that I came across her podcast, and now I became a listener and a follower. And I reached out to her and I said, "Would you come on a podcast?" And she very graciously said yes. So today on a podcast, we have Denise Izso, and she is the host of the podcast called Blacadian. So, Denise, welcome to Moments That Define Us.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thank you for inviting me and having me. I'm looking forward to talking with you today.
Yeah. Don't you think? Because a lot of the times, I think when it comes to social media, it can be very negative in a lot of aspects. But I think meeting genuinely good people and coming across really good, I don't really like the word content, but I'm gonna go with
Mhm.
that. That can be so great. Social media can be great for that.
Absolutely. I think, yeah, I've met so many wonderful people, yourself included, through social media. And I think it's what you make of it and how you use it. And I think we are both podcasters, and we're I also once you've reached out, I found your podcast and I became a listener and a fan as well. And it's I think it sort of reminds us of how social media, I think, was intended to be used, of making these connections that maybe normally wouldn't have happened, because we are living in different countries, but it's great that we're able to connect in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. And so because this is moments that define us, right? So we're going to talk about your podcast because the name, first of all, is amazing. It's Blacadian. And I also have to tell everyone that Denise is our, how do people say in America, nice neighbor from the north. So she lives in Canada. She's Canadian. So today, what I wanted to talk about today is um, your story, your defining moments, and how you come to creating this amazing podcast. And what I wanted to start with is when we because me and Denise spoke a few weeks ago just to get to know each other a little bit better and just to see if this will work out. So, and you told me that your parents are originally from Barbados. So you are
Mhm.
first generation Canadian.
Yes.
And I think what I wanted to ask you is how was it for you growing up in Canada, being a first generation Canadian and your parents being immigrants?
Yeah, I know. It's such an interesting question because I love how people perceive Canada. And, when we talked a few weeks ago, I did mention that being a first generation Canadian, um, my parents and, were very aware of being surrounded by people that didn't look like us, that didn't look like me. And so they were very intentional on how they talked about Blackness, how they talked about our culture. And we went to Barbados all the time to visit our family, and sort of being exposed in that way as well. And so growing up for me, um, it was this knowledge of difference, of othering a little bit. And it wasn't, no one was ever mean. I think that's the thing. To say that I didn't experience racism is of course not true, but it was a different type that you would expect. from everything we learn about racism, no one was, screaming at me or, these kinds of things. It was just the little subtle differences of being expected to have different interests, have different preferences, people thinking that I wouldn't want to engage in a certain way. And it it just was sort of, me turning into the spokesperson for um of Blackness. And so I remember just having that feeling. And I think I spoke and I speak a lot about my best friend from childhood. And,
Mm-hmm.
she's of Jamaican heritage, and she was born in Jamaica and came here as a child. But, we often stuck together just because, as the two Black girls in the class, we just, naturally sort of gravitated towards each other. And, we did have to sort of explain things to people. And it was just, some of it, I think also I say a lot about, I know as someone who's my lived experience of being Black in this country, I quickly and easily know the difference between someone who's genuinely interested and someone who is being, racist. And I was like, that's why I say never be afraid to ask a question. If it's genuine, no one's going to be upset. It's just when the intention is definitely clear. So we often said we talk about racism a lot, and we talk about race a lot. And, I don't mind sharing my story with everybody. I love it. I love doing it, hence the podcast. But yeah, growing up, I think it taught me a lot about being proud of um, my Blackness, being proud of being Bajan Canadian, and of my parents. And
Mm-hmm.
us. I hear a lot about people sort of shying away from it and wanting to sort of blend. And it's
Yeah.
funny because I think my experience was a little different in the sense that I was like, gather around everyone and listen to my difference. Like I never shied away from it, or, I never was like embarrassed to have
Mm-hmm.
something different to eat at the lunchroom, whatever the case may be. I was always the spokesperson. And again, I credit that a lot to my parents for just being like, people are going to be curious about you, and that's okay. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I really internalized that.
Okay, so you mentioned that you have a friend who is from Jamaican heritage.
Mhm.
And were you the only two Black girls or Black people all together in your class? Or were there other people?
There were other people of color, but it was majority like a white school that we grew
Mm,
up in. So we were um, typically, I think there was a couple of other boys that were also from the Caribbean, but again, we didn't want to hang out with them so much. But yeah, it was predominantly, white school. And
mm,
so, yeah, we just sort of connected.
yeah. Did you, because you mentioned that you credit a lot your parents, of talking to you, that how people will be curious and you felt like others at times. So did you, when, I'm just always curious, when did you start feeling like that? Because I wonder at what age kids starting to see, okay, I am different than this girl or than this boy. So at what
Mhm.
age did you start feeling that otherness?
I would say pretty much immediately as soon as I went to school. I think um, I just, again, it wasn't anything mean. It was just I always noticed. And again, it maybe I did, I was lucky enough to stay at home with my parents until I went to school. So I never like went to daycare or anything like that. So like my first experience of school was going into, kindergarten. And so I think my parents were prepping me for that, possibly. So I think I immediately sort of noticed it. And but I didn't feel maybe, and I think, yeah, nobody, I don't remember for many of those early years, anyone, even othering me or anything like that. I think it was all just a welcome party. I think it was probably around grade 2 when I
Mm,
think I started noticing a little bit more of the, oh, I don't know about this. But yeah, it was sort of, I would say almost immediately, I was like, okay, I'm just a little, people have different traditions than me, or, no one's like, my parents would pull us out of school to just go to Barbados. I think it was, sometimes it was around events, but sometimes it
mm.
was just like my parents found a cheap flight and they were like, guess what, kids, you're going to Barbados. So we were like, okay. So yeah, so I'd have to explain to everybody that we're going to Barbados, and everyone would be like, oh, tell me about that. So I think it was around grade 2, I think, when I really noticed the, maybe you would be more comfortable not doing this because you're different. And the other thing is, no one would ever say it was because I was Black. It was always another reason, like, oh, maybe I just thought you really liked, you didn't like this game, or whatever the case may be. But it was
Mm,
obvious that I didn't really fit into their imagining of, what that game would look like. So I felt a little, yeah. But then if I said like, oh, I would, everyone would be like, of course. So I never felt like that push out.
yeah.
I think I did have to speak up a little if I was like, oh no, I want to do this too, or gymnastics, or whatever the case may be. So
Hmm.
yeah.
It's interesting how you're describing this because it makes me think about the US and how people are treated in US. And I think just from listening to you and from from talking to you before and even from listening to your podcast, it is a little bit different, right? Because when we look at Canada and US, on the surface they seem, they seem kind of the same,
Mhm.
when you don't dig too deep, right? But then when you start digging deeper into the history and everything, like, yes, there are similarities, but there's also a difference. And so just to a few more questions on kind of growing up and your childhood. So because you mentioned that you, because there were not a lot of people of color in your school, so sometimes you felt like you had to be that spokesperson. And I think it's also maybe different. I mean, not maybe, it's different when you are, 25 or 35 versus when you 6, 7, and 8, right, where you have to be the spokesperson. So
Mhm.
how, and I don't know if you remember the feeling, how was it for you being that spokesperson? Did you feel like there was a lot of pressure? Did you feel like you have to speak for everyone, or did you have, okay, I just have to speak for myself? Like, how was it for you in those early ages?
That's such a great question, because, as I've, grown and matured into it and just sort of embraced the role, I did find it, I was really at first, not wanting to be having the spotlight on me. I'm naturally sort of an introvert. And, I just didn't want to, everyone wants a day off. And sometimes I didn't want to have those conversations or be that spokesperson. And, it was sort of a burden. And I think I've told this story, I tell this story a lot to my friends. One of my friends, and he was, growing up in a predominantly white school, and he was talking about how he had exchange students from Africa and how they were so popular, and, they were all this and, great, and all the sports teams and all these things. And, I knew exactly what was happening. I could have just imagine what those kids were going through with having the spotlight on them, and, being, having the burden of being the only, Black or person that these kids have met. And so I was just like, wow, it must have been really difficult for them, to sort of, be the center of attention and sort of, always be on at, especially in high school. It's such an awkward time. And, I could tell, like, I felt like my friend was just, he's really great, but I could tell that I sort of, made him reflect on that, something that he
Mm-hmm.
probably never occurred to him. Cause I was like, I know what it's like to be that person, to be the only person. And some days you don't want to be. Some days you just want to, blend. You just want to, not have that on you. And so I think yeah, I remember some days just, this, I don't think we had, Google at the time.
Yeah.
But, it's sort of, it's a Google it kind of moment. But yeah, it's just one of those things where it does get heavy.
Mm,
But again, like I was saying, I quickly learned the difference where people are just curious. And I do appreciate that it does take a level of bravery as well to ask the question. So I always want to be that person so they have a positive experience. But some days, especially when I was younger, it was not fun for
yeah.
sure. Yeah.
It's interesting because I think I don't want to say every, right? Because again, we can speak for everybody, but I spoke to my husband and he was saying the same thing. He said sometimes it's exhausting that you have to explain everything, and it's like there are so many resources now, but we as Black people still have this like heaviness on us. Is like we didn't create racism, so why do we have to be like, explain to everybody? But yeah, and then he would say, yeah, and then there are times where like if you genuinely curious and the how you ask the question matters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think also during pandemic, right, when everything was happening here in the States, um, a lot of people were where he was telling me were reaching out to him and like, oh, what do you think I should do? And it's like, go, I don't know, don't be racist, And
Yes.
so I think sometimes I can see, how it's sometimes hard on him too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think my kind of like last questions with growing up, so when your parents came to the States, and I'm curious just because I'm an immigrant myself, did they come here together or did they come here separately and just met here and married here?
Yeah, no, they did actually come together and then they did get married here in Canada. So they made their plans to come over together. So it's always, yeah, I think it was always just their ambition to go. And my mom had older siblings who had come to Canada first. And so
Mm-hmm.
they were in Ottawa, which is, part of Ontario. And so it's actually the capital of Canada. So they came over, and so yeah, it was very interesting that they did meet. They are both from Barbados and then just married here. But
They
yeah,
married here.
yeah,
And then, is there a big population? I don't know how to say it correctly. Barbadians, like the people from,
yeah.
yeah, okay. Is there a big community there?
Um, not particularly. I think everyone is like some sort of distant relative here.
Yeah.
And but I think the biggest population from Caribbean people is actually Jamaica in Canada. And
Okay.
so Barbados in generally is just a very small island. I think our population now is like maybe 300,000 people. So it's generally just a small island, so we don't have that many people. But I think whenever I see or hear another person from Barbados, I immediately have to shout about how my parents are from Barbados. So I remember I was in a cab, and so I just this listening to the accent, he reminded me so much of my father. And so the
Oh,
cab driver, and so he was like chatting on his cell phone, and then I interrupted him, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, well, where are you from in Barbados?" And we had a funny conversation afterward.
my next question was going to be if you visited Barbados, but it seems like your parents would just take you out of school to go
Yeah.
to Barbados. So, so you are a mom, right? You have two
Yes,
children,
I do.
two
Yes, a
children,
boy and a girl. Yeah.
a boy and a girl. And is your husband also from Barbados or is he from somewhere else?
No, he is Canadian born as well, but his heritage is actually Jamaican. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so it's like a Caribbean household.
Very nice. So
Yeah.
when you and your husband raising your kids, I'm always curious about this as somebody who, who is either first generation or who came to another country from their country at a very young age, and especially when we become parents. Do you have your culture heavily present in how you're raising your kids, or or is it more Canadian now? Because they are,
Yeah.
the second generation.
Yes, that's the thing. I think we try and do a good balance of it, but I think it's definitely more Canadian than my upbringing for sure. But I do, we have like, a lot of the I think cultural things like just because as I become a parent or became a parent and you slowly go in to become your parents and
Isn't that funny?
isn't it something, yeah. So I laugh because I see the similarities, but like culturally with food, and we have caravana, like it's like a parade, or it's like a cultural parade in
Hmm.
Canada that we have every year. And so there's lots of costumes and the music, and exposing them in that way. So, and of course, through hearing stories from my parents and my aunts and uncles, and just exposing them in that way, I think is really important. But I think, yeah, I'm fairly Canadianized as well, so I do like that balance. But yeah, I think it's important. I think it's important because I know what it meant for me growing up to have
Hmm.
that sense of identity. So I'm very like, we're very intentional about it, and we like to answer questions, and we get them like little books and everything. And so it's so important, I think, to have that sense of culture and identity. But yeah, I was thinking of just the other day with Halloween, and I think I mentioned what I have an older sister, and she had to explain to my parents what Halloween was. And so
There is Halloween in Canada as well, right?
yes, it
Okay,
is.
I just
On
didn't
the
know that's
Yeah,
very
no,
American.
no, yes, it is very American, but we do it here. But of course, in Barbados, did not do it. And so my sister, who's 6 years older than me, she did say, she was like, "You're welcome for explaining Halloween," because by the time I was ready to go, they were well versed in what they had to do, get the costume, take me out door to door, because it was insane to them to think, going to strangers' homes and asking for candy. They thought, there's no way this is a thing. So yeah, it's nice that they, were well aware. But also just with the checking of the Halloween candy. So, once you get it back, and my parents were ruthless on throwing away my candy. And so doing it for my children, I did the same thing. Like anything I just like got rid of right away. And so they of course complained to the grandparents about it. So,
Aw.
and so I got a lot of "I told you so's," and I was like, what, just turning into your parents. But yeah, what can you do?
It is. It is. I think when the older we get, the more we become like a parents. And I think once once we ourselves become parents, it's just like you started thinking, okay, why did my mom did this? Why did my dad say this?
Mm,
Why didn't they let me go to that party or hang out with those people? You know what I mean? It just
yes,
becomes very,
yes.
very, very clear. But that's so interesting, talking to you about how you raise your kids, because so my husband is American. And so for me, at the very, I didn't speak too much Ukrainian to my kids, which I was very guilty of. But I chosen the easier path, because my husband, American, he doesn't speak
Mhm.
Ukrainian. So it was, I always felt that kind of, that Ukrainian guilt. But then
Mhm.
when my mom started coming, because at the beginning, before the war started, like when my daughter was born, my daughter was, she's 7 now and my son is 5. So when she started coming, she started teaching them Ukrainian,
Mm.
and cooking food and everything. So now I'm so grateful my parents live here now. They live about 15
Mm.
minutes walking from us. So, they go there, they speak Ukrainian. It's so funny because my son, who is 5, would like argue with my dad in Ukrainian. and it's the funniest thing to watch. But I do think that it is important for a children to know what, like, where their parents from and what makes them who they are, right? That they have all this different culture. So I'm always, like, curious to ask, because I have a lot of friends who are immigrants, and one of my friends, she is Brazilian, and her husband is French. And going to their house, it's like being in this, like, international house of where there's English, Portuguese,
Mhm.
and French is spoken, and the kids are, just speaking in all different languages. But yeah, I didn't do as of a good job with that. Um, so now I wanted to switch. Well, we kind of started talking about
Mm.
Canada, but I do wanted to switch gears to just the motherland, Canada. And in America, mostly in America, because in Ukraine it wasn't, we just knew Canada, but like, we had some relatives that moved to Canada very, very long time ago. But when you talk to Americans here in Canada, you get, like, different different opinions, right? So you always hear,
Mhm.
oh, a nice neighbor from the north, right? You hear, oh, people in Canada are so nice, the healthcare is free there, it's just much better country than America. And then some Americans, being very patriotic, like, oh, hating this, oh, they're so nice. And I was like, okay, what is wrong with you for hating people because of their nice? So I wanted to, like, clear that with you as Canadian. Is that people in Canada really are as nice as everybody talks about them?
Yeah. Well, it's so funny because that's one of the things that, I was thinking of as well. And I, work in, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I often hear about how, our comparison to Americans, and how, we're so, nice here. And I think, yes, in a way, I would say Canadians are, nice, but I think it's a little bit of it manifests itself differently. So I
Mm-hmm.
think people do, get, we are human and we get like those same sort of frustrations, but I don't even know if people will realize like when Canadians are getting upset, because we'll just be like, okay, it's sort of like this defeatist kind of attitude, or we get really maybe a little quiet, but I think we do apologize a lot. Just naturally, if we I think it's the craziest thing. I think if you bump into somebody, you apologize to them. That definitely does happen. And so someone was like telling me, we have friends as well that are an American, and they were like, they bumped into you, why are you apologizing? And I was like, just the Canadian coming out in me. But one of the things about racism, particularly when I think of Canada, is the subtlety of it. And I think it's one of the frustrating things about it is that when people talk about their experience in Canada with racism, Indigenous people, any people of color, they'll talk about this, and people will say, oh, I've never, seen this outward show of, racism. And they'll, of course, talk about Americans. They'll talk about, the KKK or whatever the case may be. And so people will say, yeah, there's examples, where someone, they're fifth generation, Chinese Canadian, and they'll say, people will assume that I'm, you know, an immigrant here to Canada, even though I'm very, have a long history in Canada. And they were saying that's the kind of racism. Like, so where does that come from? So obviously you're taught about what a Canadian looks like. I remember flying, my husband and I years ago, we were flying through, oh my goodness, I want to say North or South Carolina. We were just stopping through and we were going on to I can't even remember. I want to say Las Vegas, but anyways, or I think it was Hawaii. But anyways, the point is that the woman there at the counter, she was Black, and she was like, "Oh, you're from Canada? I didn't know they had Black people in Canada." And I was like, "Oh, yes, we're here." They're here. So it's just, people have this idea of what Canadians look like, and they
Yeah.
certainly don't, look like me or even like, Chinese Canadians. So I think, those sort of subtle ways that you're sort of, told that you aren't here and you don't belong. I think that's sort of a way that Canada has that deep racist history. And so it does come out in things like that, where, and again, I think I shared this story, but it's when there was years ago, there was this I Am Canada commercial. I think it was for like a beer,
Hmm.
and one of I was in university, and our professor was talking about it, and she brought it up because I think even at that time it was an older campaign, and so she talked about it, and she said, if this person was Chinese Canadian and they have a long history here, would you accept that they were Canadian? And we were like, wow, mind blown, because of course the spokesperson for this commercial was like a white presenting person wearing like a plaid like lumberjack and so it just fits every stereotype that you think of
Mm.
for a Canadian person. And so but what was interesting is that people were very hesitant to make that connection. Like they were very resistant in calling themselves racist. And so I was very comfortable being like, yep, I would have been like questioning the campaign, how racist of me. So I was so willing to go on that journey. And so I find that Canadians are very reluctant to accept that about themselves. They believe the polite Canadian, the good Canadian stereotype about themselves, and they'll never go any deeper. So I find that part frustrating. But I do think um, if someone was, had a problem with me being Black, they would probably not say anything about it. And I think that's the difference a little bit. They would feel it and think it, and it would definitely show itself, but they would definitely try and hide it a little bit more here in
Mm.
Canada. Yeah.
It's interesting. Like so many things I started thinking when you were talking, like it's these countries that have done, colonization of all different people. They like how they represent themselves as this white, blue, blonde hair, blue eyes, plaided jacket, whatever they wear, Um, and also hearing you say, which I think it's very similar to US, to where people will never acknowledge that they are racist. They do not
Mm-hmm.
go deep. And I don't know if it's the same in Canada, and I don't know also if Canada has this history like America does, with enslavement and, Jim Crow and all of those civil rights movement and everything that has been happening for the past 400 years. But it's interesting how, like, the white people of these countries will never admit we did that, we did this, and now let's acknowledge that and let's try to change it. It's like it happened, like in America they say it happened a long time ago, let's get over it
Mm-hmm.
when
Mm-hmm.
it comes to racism. But when it comes to what happened to 9/11, and it's like never forget,
Mm-hmm.
um, but if you mention something when it comes to, equity, no, no, no. And especially, my goodness, now it's like, let's get rid of everything that
Mm-hmm.
was ever put in place, which also wasn't that long ago. A lot of the stuff that was put in place here was because of what happened in 2020, right? That was
Mm-hmm.
like kind of big corporations that DIY, not DIY, but diversity and inclusion, right? Everybody, diversity and inclusion. And then
Mm-hmm.
it kind of slowly died down, as
Mm-hmm.
it always does. What other interesting thing I remember talking with you is that how Native people in Canada treated.
Mm.
And it seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Native people in Canada treated worse than Black people in Canada. And I think that's the difference here. Here, I think
Hmm.
it's reverse. So
Yes.
can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was sharing that story with you about the omission. I think, anti-Black racism is front and center here in Canada, and there's all these, policies in place, and also it's just more on people's minds. So people will, be very conscious of, addressing their anti-Black racism within themselves, and very, very much so. And then Indigenous people and here in Canada are often forgotten when it comes to conversations about equity and inclusion. And I know, I think I mentioned that my one of my girlfriends and I, we were pregnant around the same time, and she shared with me her experience um, going through the medical system where they were testing her for, alcoholism and, like, fetal alcohol syndrome and all of these things. And I was like, oh, that wasn't, like, because you get a barrage of tests. And I was like, oh, yeah, no, no one, uh, I didn't get that test or whatever. And she was like, yeah, it's because I'm Indigenous that they, and there's like the stereotype of Indigenous people that have had, ties to alcoholism. And so I was shocked that, it was presenting itself in this institution, and it was, um, something that she had to sort of, advocate and fight for her care, that it kept coming up. And I was just thinking that that's just the case where, I went through, my experience and, received the care, and nobody, I didn't feel any, racism through my experience. And it was very impactful to me to think of that and sort of see those connections, because I also shared, some of my friends that are Indigenous, they present as white. And so they don't share with anybody that they are Indigenous, because they'll get questions about, being on reservations, or, here in Canada, we do have programs where Indigenous people can study at certain institutions for free. And so people will, like, talk about, oh, how you got your degrees for free. Like, I have all these student loans. And, so my friend was saying, like, yeah, that was probably the last time, in a long time that I told people, that I was, 18. I was like, okay, yeah, fair enough, because you don't want to have, those conversations. And so there is that difference where I think, and again, I do think it's because of American history that anti-Black racism is so on people's minds and so
Mm.
addressed. And so when it comes to our own history with Indigenous people, um, it's often overlooked, and people don't want to face that histories. And even around the fact that there are reservations still here, that there's land, where people were, moved out of, desired areas when it came to, people wanting to take over, and sort of being pushed out of their native lands. And one of the things that we do is talking about um, doing statements of, acknowledgement for land acknowledgements when we're in meetings and having these things. So we talk about that we are on Indigenous land, and people don't really understand the meaning behind that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it's really important to address those histories. So I do think that Canadians, we again love to be ignorant of our history. So when I talk of things about, like, the a Chinese head tax, so it was something about, having extra taxes for Chinese Canadians that were working here through our railroads, or, limitations on immigration for people that were, coming in from, I think it was another Asian country, people coming in from, I think it was India at the time as well. So there was, like, very strict restrictions around that. And so no one wants to think about those Canadian histories or the fact that there was slavery as well. We, know the story about the Underground Railroad where everyone comes to Canada and there was, all this freedom here, but we did have enslavement, especially of Indigenous peoples as well here
Mm-hmm.
in Canada, probably just frankly because there wasn't any Black people to be enslaved. But they did have Indigenous people being enslaved. And so the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, we say the RCMP here, they were actually created as like our police system. And their first task was like to actually like catch people that were runaways in like slaves. And so, they have like this noble history. Everyone is saying, there are police officers here and like what a great history. And then if you look at it without a lens of, when you look at it with the lens of, racism and equity, you find out that they started off with basically just sort of enforcing slavery. So you're like, you do have to talk about that too. Of course, now they are protecting communities, but you have to talk about that part of our history as well.
It's the same here in US,
Hmm.
with the police, right? Like
Hmm.
what was their task? So there is same, I feel like there. But you know what I wanted to ask you, because you were talking about the acknowledgement of the land, right?
Hmm.
So we do the same here, here in US in some of the meetings at work, and like, my husband works in education, so they do that. And I wonder, what are your thoughts on acknowledgement of the land?
I really like it. And again, I spoke with a couple of my friends um, as Indigenous people, if it's something that they find, suitable, or if it's, kind of patronizing. And they actually really liked it, especially when they were saying people sort of make it meaningful to them and talk about it because she was saying to me that it's something that they would have done at any gathering. So it's sort of a way of having their culture represented
Mm-hmm.
on a larger scale, which never really happens. And so I was like, oh, that's so important to note that it's something that, it's a way of seeing yourselves represented in on a larger scale. So I think it's a nice way because I thought, is it good? Are we just, obviously we are still on the land and, we have, taken the land and, she was saying a lot of people recognize that it is a complicated history. So people that are living here today aren't responsible for, the takeover of these lands. And so telling someone to give up their home because of something that happened, however long ago, she was saying it's complicated. I get it. But
Mm-hmm.
she was saying it was really nice. The land acknowledgement is something that, she was saying that when she's in her community, they do gather if they're having an event, they do smudging ceremonies or a prayer and sort of having that acknowledgement. So she was saying it's absolutely nice and important to do. So
Yeah.
it makes me feel better about it. And also when I do them, when I do meetings at work, I also try to make it more meaningful and sort of talking about all the things I do get from my land. So, thinking about, this is where I, live and raise my children. And, I even talk about sometimes that I have a small garden that it provides for me. So these are all things that, we had some consultations with people about things that we should include in our land acknowledgement. So
Mm-hmm.
I love that people are thinking of it as well.
Okay. The
Yeah.
reason I ask you that because and it's interesting that how your friend feels about this, being an indigenous person, because to me when I hear that, and maybe it is different, like when you go from place to place, right? This when people do land acknowledgement, but to me, so what I've heard, okay, let's how they say, let's we wanted to acknowledge that we are in an indigenous land,
Mhm.
and that's it, and then let's carry on with our lives. So to
Mm.
me, I always feel uneasy about that, because it's like, okay, what are you, because like hearing your friend saying, okay, when indigenous people gather, because they, to them, they acknowledge the land because it's their land, it's very sacred, right? So it's
Mm,
different. But when I hear, especially when white people say it to me, it's like, okay, you're acknowledging you stole this land. Maybe it's not you necessarily, right? Because it
mm,
happened, a long time ago and everything. And that's it. And let's just move on. You know what I mean?
mm,
Because
mhm,
and I hear when people say, like, it's not my fault, it happened, was my ancestors. But like, okay, what can we living now still on this land, right? So
mm,
why do indigenous people in Canada, in US, still feel so underrepresented, right? And
mm,
also hearing when people in Canada say, I don't want to even say I'm indigenous because then I will get this question. But also, how even dare you asking, also, you got your free education, well, your
mm.
people stole my people's land, so let's not, you know what I mean, let's not
Yes.
compete here.
Mhm.
um like, you
Yes.
know what I mean. Okay, let's acknowledge the land, moving on to the.
Yes. Yeah, that's the thing. I do feel like people don't maybe understand the reason behind it. And so it does feel like a little bit of a checkbox. Okay, we have to
Mm.
do this now. And yeah, I think that's one of the issues with it. And so that's why I was saying I felt like, is it, patronizing to you? And yeah, she was saying it depends on, the intent behind it as well. And yeah, I love you were saying it's so true. You're like, well, it's the benefits. I think what happens is that people don't recognize that even though it did happen a long time ago, indigenous people don't have their land back now. So you are still benefiting from the fact that someone did take it away. So I think it's one of those things that people don't really draw that connection to. So I try and make it as meaningful as you can. So I love that point though. But it's true, you're like, well, your people stole the land. So it's a very valid point. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's that piece of not going deeper, right? Like, it's not my
Mhm.
fault. It's not my,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
taking any responsibility from ourselves. It's not my fault. It happened a long time ago. But like you said, you are still benefiting from being on this
Mhm.
land. Maybe that somebody you never knew did this, but you still,
Mhm.
we are still benefiting from being on this land. So that's always just especially like, being here in the States and hearing when people say, get out of this country, like,
Mhm.
and it's like, I think the only people who can say this is indigenous people to all of
Yeah.
us that are
Yep.
here, right? But when you are somebody who, your grandpa came from Italy or Spain or whatever, you know what I mean? Like, let's not go there. But I'm telling you, like, this the situation in America, it's all, oh my goodness.
Yes, I was gonna say I imagine there was the big election results not too long ago, and it's just been yeah, we're all your neighbors from the north are just watching anxiously of what's going to be happening next year. And I don't know if there's a change, if you feel like a change in the climate, how things are feeling, how people are feeling with this.
I think after, like, the day after the election, because
Mm-hmm.
prior, like, a few days prior to election, people were feeling uh, like Kamala Harris is going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And then the day after the election, um, people were feeling, very down. But also, what was interesting, I decided not to, and I don't watch too much news. I
Mm-hmm.
get my news from, like, when either that's a historian or somebody, right? Like, smart people that not just screaming and scaring everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And it was interesting to hear this woman who is the researcher and a professor at the university kind of explaining in a very um, good way of why he won.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because the way and not that she was pro him or anything, but she was just trying to explain it just neutral, right? Okay, why he won. And she was like, I think people just, especially working class, right? Because I
Mm,
think no matter what, both parties, they have big donors and everything, and I think they trying to appeal more to big corporation and big money because that's where get
mhm,
their money.
mhm,
And so she was saying that like that the Democratic Party wasn't really speaking to working class, and working class felt like they weren't really, that kind of people forgot about them. And not that
mhm,
he's just crazy, what he's saying. It's sometimes it's like you look at him and it's like your drunk uncle at the wedding just saying stuff that you're like, oh my
mhm,
gosh, did you just say that? And that people were, okay, he's kind of like he is speaking my language, right? He
mm,
gave
mhm,
people permission to speak like that,
mhm,
to act like that, because I was just thinking how you said, if people in Canada had problem with me being a black woman, they wouldn't say it, they would show it, but they would hide it,
mhm.
right?
Yes.
And and now, like, more than ever, like, people in America were always saying horrendous things, but I think Trump gave people this permission to be even more like vulgar and
Mm,
loud and say stupid things. I don't know how else to say it,
mhm,
stupid and hurtful things.
mhm.
Because it's one thing, he's like, oh, he's just saying what he thinks. I'm like, it's not always a good thing. Like, we teach our
Yeah.
kids, right, that
Mhm.
sometimes you don't say stuff which you think, because we
Yeah.
all have crazy thoughts, but that doesn't mean that we're gonna go, outside and tell, crazy things to our neighbors. um
Yes.
so I think, because you were asking how is the climate and stuff, I think what people are thinking, kind of like, okay, we've been through this before 4 years
Mhm,
ago, right?
mhm,
We kind of know how he is, but I was talking to somebody yesterday and she was saying, yeah, but I feel like he's much more unhinged now than he
mhm.
was before. So people kind of know what to expect, and then on the other hand, they don't know what to expect, because he might be saying a lot of things, but will he do that? You know what I mean?
Mm, yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
also, it's just talking, just economics, right? He's like, oh, I'm going to do big deportation, but do you know how much that's going to cost, right?
Yeah.
What, like, there are people that are working here and paying, into the system. So
Mhm.
it's just like, it's just somebody, it really is, to me, seems like somebody that you met at the wedding and they got drunk and they just like saying stuff, having no idea like the actual facts and what's going to happen
Yeah.
and what it's going to cost the country,
Yes. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know?
I do think it's true. Like, I think it's just a I think, yeah, the selling of these promises. And I think that was, not to say, I don't want to say anything pro, but I think that was definitely the strength of his campaign, was being able to sell, those promises of you can be um, who they've been telling you it's not okay for you to be.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can say these crazy hurtful things, and people didn't wanted to go back to feeling, it's okay that I'm, feeling these things, or I don't like these things, or, I don't like, women's rights, like, everything. Like, he just sort of appealed to a broader range of people to say, um, change, we don't like change, basically.
Mm-hmm.
um so yeah, it's interesting that but yeah, I think it's the unknown. I think the unknown is always sort of a nervous, makes you a little anxious. So yeah, I don't know if the impact that he's promising, like you said, with the economy, if it's even realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the whole him building like that wall, we all know how that turned out. It didn't really,
Exactly, that was,
you know so it's sort of those things where you're not really sure the impact he's going to make, but yeah.
yeah, and plus he's old too, so
Yeah. I know.
oh my goodness. Yeah, I'll keep you posted. It's
Yeah.
like, it's so funny because people like, oh, I'll move to Canada. I was
Yeah.
like, are you sure that? And it's usually like people were saying before the election, right? Like, oh, if Kamala wins, I'm moving to Mexico. So you don't
Mm,
feel, kind of we're talking to this, so you don't feel safe. So you need to move. So do
yeah.
you see how that works when people don't feel safe in there? No, it's not the same.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
it's not the same because it's about you, but
Yeah. Exactly. You're like, it's exactly the same.
it's
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly the same. Um, okay, so now I wanted to move to Blacadian Podcast.
Yes.
Tell us about the name. I know the name, but I think I know why you chose that name, but why did you choose that name?
Yes, it's so funny because I thought about the name and it's Black and Canadian together, and I it just became Blacadian, and I was like, well, anyone know what that is? But it was like sort of a joke with one of my friends because we always say that we're like Blacadian. So, it's like instead of saying Canadian, we always put like, black in front of it. And so there's before my time, there was this old movie and it just made me laugh so hard, but it was Dracula, but he is black. So they called him Blackula. so, so I always say that it's like Blacadian, it's like Canadian, like Blackula. So I'm a Black Canadian. But yeah, so that's where the name came up from. came from.
I think the name Denise is what first drew me before I even um I think before I even went into, because I think I was on social media looking for different podcasters. And I
Mhm,
was like, ooh, because the name, it's like you first are drawn to the name and then you go
mhm,
in and say, oh, it's interesting name. I remember
mhm,
somebody told us this about a podcast. Oh, it's such an interesting name.
mhm.
So my next question is, who did you have in mind when you decided to do the podcast? Who is your podcast intended for?
Such a good question. So, yeah, I think with the name and my intended audience, it was for people, probably, well, everyone, but I think people that maybe are white presenting, that are maybe a little nervous about talking about racism, wanting to ask certain questions, but they maybe don't have, people of color in their lives or their communities that they can reach out to, and you can learn things from a book, but there's social things maybe they're a little more curious about. And so my friends and I, that I've known since childhood, who's Jamaican, she was saying that we talk about these things all the time, and these are our experiences. We have these conversations, and I don't think people benefit from having these talks of why this was awkward or why this came up in conversation. And so I wanted people to feel that it was a safe space that they could come and learn. And so that's why the name also was sort of a little silly, because we do talk about heavy issues like race and racism, but I wanted people to be like, oh, is she referencing Blackula? So this is so silly. So I wanted people to know that this is a place where you can come and laugh, and but also learn a little bit, and maybe have those questions answered.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And when did the defining moment come for you to where, like, okay, I wanted to start this?
Such a good question. And I was thinking about that a lot. I think it was when I was speaking with one of my girlfriends, and she was telling me that because we both work in predominantly white spaces, and so she had gotten her some braids done. So she had like very long like braids, and she got them done, and I was like commenting because we were out for lunch, and I was like, oh my gosh, your hair is amazing. And she was like, thanks, but she's like, I'm dreading going into work tomorrow because like all of my coworkers who are white presenting are going to be like all up in my hair. And I was just laughing so much. And, we could laugh about it, but I did know that this was a real source of anxiety for her. Like she knew that she is going to have to go in there tomorrow and, address all of these questions and, be polite. And, maybe people are going to be in her just the boundaries. I think they're going to be
Mhm.
crossing some boundaries, and she was nervous about it. And I thought, isn't it funny how she could be so, real with me, because she knew that I was going to understand where she was coming from, but she didn't feel comfortable that she was going to go into this space. And she was so worried about protecting others, feelings, because again, the intention was not going to be malicious, but it still was going to make her uncomfortable. And I thought, wouldn't that be something that I could talk about? Because I feel like, if I did have this podcast and someone was listening and they thought, oh my goodness, I think I was, someone who did that to my coworker, and I was just genuinely wanting to, compliment her hair, but maybe I did go a little too deeper, like, because, everyone gets new hairstyles. But then for Black women, particularly, it crosses this line between a curiosity. It's no longer like, oh, I have a new hair color. Your hair looks great. Thank you so much. And moving on, it becomes a
Mhm.
deeper conversation around, culture. And, sometimes you just don't want to have that conversation about your
Yeah.
hair. And so I thought, wouldn't it be nice if I could help someone, maybe be a little more mindful of how they were acting? And so I thought I could do the podcast. And again, in university, I wrote a paper just around this very issue around culture and Blackness. And it was titled, Can I Touch Your Hair? And it really spoke to me, because my professor, she just said, aside from like the fact that she loved it and it was really well written, she was like, I just learned something. She was like, thank you, Denise. Like, I still have it in, my house, because, she just wrote across like the top front page, like, thank you, Denise. It was truly, inspiring for me to read. And we had a conversation about it afterwards. And so it really just, I thought, with that paper and with this conversation, I really wanted me to start the podcast so that people could have that space to learn, and, in a just in a way that was, not accusing them of anything. Because I think people often are afraid to ask because they're afraid of being accused of something.
Mm. Was your professor Black or white?
She was a white woman.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
The hair thing,
Hmm.
it's very having my daughter, and she's mixed. So
Hmm.
I saw that firsthand, what it was um like how much hair has to do with the culture.
Hmm.
Because I remember she was, and she, when she was little, she was born with a lot of hair. So she had this, like, so my hair is red. I don't know if you can see it, but her hair is much lighter and like just beautiful afro. And I remember she got sick and I had to take her to the doctor. She had fever and everything. And so I'm holding her. She was not even a year old, right? And it was not cold outside, so she didn't have a hat, but just, the hair. And
Hmm.
this lady, I kid you not, I hear somebody screaming, ma'am, ma'am. And I, like trying to hold, and I'm turning, and she's like, can you please wait? And so I'm like holding her. She's, trying to get to the doctor, and she was like,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, your baby's hair. So, and she was like trying to touch it. I was like, don't
Oh,
touch
that's
her hair.
yes.
Don't
Yeah.
touch her hair. Like,
Hmm.
and so, I obviously never experienced that, because it's just like hair, I think being white hair is not that, like, it's not a big part of culture, right?
Hmm.
But I had to learn then with my daughter. And that, I mean, I made me so upset because she was running. I look
Hmm.
and she was running towards me. Um, so yeah,
Mm,
that's so cool that not only that you're doing the podcast, but also that you wrote that paper and you were able to help your professor understand something or learn something that she maybe genuinely didn't know, right? And that's kind of comes
mhm,
to that, okay, are you really curious and wanting to know, or are you
mhm,
trying to, like, kind of protect yourself, and you know what I mean? So it's just
mhm.
depends where it's coming from.
Yes,
um
I just got chills from your story with your daughter, because
mm,
yeah, that's I'm so sorry that that happened, but yeah, I want to say that I'm not also surprised, because there is yeah, just that boundary crossing, I think is just it's huge. And of course, you're a mom with a sick baby. You're like, going through it. You don't have
Mm.
time to, you know, even educate this woman about, what she's doing. You're just in the moment trying to take care of your family. So, wow, thank you for sharing that because it's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like it's that boundary, it's that like not even seeing and understanding like that first of all you are just in my and my child personal space. Let's start there.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
how are you just going and you seeing that she's like kind of lying on me and everything,
Mm-hmm.
but then second like, well, I just wanted to touch your hair. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what is she, an animal? Like, why are you coming and doing that? Like, what right do you have?
Mm-hmm.
But it's just that I think the ignorance of, well, I'm not doing anything bad,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which it drives me crazy. There are so many episodes that I've listened to, and I was like trying to see not which one are my favorite because they're like each of them. I have to just tell you about your podcast, what I really like. There's so many things, but like you have like the way you talk is really soothing, right? So you listen to your episode and they are short enough because like you said, sometimes the topic can be a little bit heavier. And also I remember I was listening to one of your episodes and I had to like stop and make a note on my phone just so I can like go back and look at it, and just something I had to research, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so good. But one particular episode I want you to talk about because, and I'm going to tell you why. Because today we talk a lot about also a little bit heavier topic, racism and how just kind of in general, and you were telling about Canada and US and everything, but you have this episode that is Black and Happy, and I want you to talk about that episode because when I listened to that episode, Denise, I was like smiling in my soul because it was so beautiful. And I just, through the episode and through your words, I just felt how proud you are of who you are. And you don't want to be anybody else. You don't want to, just the proudness. I want you to talk about that because I think that that's a great way of wrap this up, and also of wrap up that part of your podcast.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much. I'm glad you enjoy it. But yeah, I think I love talking about um, being Black and happy because oftentimes I feel that especially with like the history of enslavement and people expect Black people to just be really down all the time, and it's of course racism impacts our lives, but um, it's also we do live our life, and um, being happy I find is also an act of resistance because in spite of all the hatred, in spite of all of the all of this the burdens of the world, to be Black and happy is a sign of being resilient and resistant, and it really does um, make me uh and I think it's just, a general, outlook on things about just, looking on the brighter side. But it's one of those things where, I often think that I love, I think I talk about in the episode, just, historically enslaved people would have, these moments of joy. They would have these, things, and, they couldn't understand how they could have those moments of joy. And it's life. I mean, even if this is what's happening in your life at this moment, focusing on how you can have that joy. So I love celebrating my Blackness, being happy, and just I I do I think I feel that sometimes people are surprised by the happiness, and I think I I think I mentioned, I don't know if it was in this particular episode, but one of my favorite episodes, it's of shows. It's called King of Queens. And, the main character, his best friend, is a Black guy. And he was saying that, he was going skiing. And he was just saying that he was doing as public service because it's good for the people in Colorado to know what a Black person looks like skiing. And I was just crying. It always stands out to me because he knows that someone's definitely going to be thinking it at that some point on that mountain. And so he was like, I feel good about that. And so I do feel like, when I'm out in the world and I'm being happy and I'm, being Black, that I do feel that it's about spreading that joy around, and also showing that resilience. And it makes, I feel like I'm doing something to make my parents proud, and my grandparents, and just I do really do feel like it is a form of resistance. And it's a one way, and it's also good for myself, but I also do feel like it's a good movement as well for people to focus on, not always being in this mode of survival, and like being able to have rest, and being deserving of rest and joy. I think is something that I really advocate
Mhm.
for Black people as well. So yeah, absolutely. Black happiness and joy is so key and important. So thank you so much for mentioning that episode. But it's something that I really think is so important.
Absolutely. That was so beautiful. Thank you for having this conversation and for opening up and for trusting me to to ask you these questions. But I thought that it was very important to talk about that episode and for you to explain it. And I'm gonna post that episode because, like I said, it's it's it- it's good to talk about hard things, but it's also good to hear the joy, right? And like I said, I am gonna send that episode to a few of my friends because just beautiful. Um,
Thank you
and
so
to
much.
and to close out our conversation, because this is moments that define us, and you spoke, you're defining moments around the podcast. But when you think about, Denise, from just when you think about your life, what some defining moments that come to your mind that make you the person you are today?
That's such a good question. I think one of one of the first defining moments I can think of is, one of my friends that I've had for such a long time, like, growing up. And she was, I went off, we were going off to university, and I went into like this, university no one's ever going to hear of, but it's a prestigious school here in Canada, and I got into like an engineering program. I quickly switched out of that because I am not. I am not. I don't know what I was thinking, but I went to sociology, but she was sort of said to me, "Oh, imagine if you became like richer than me." And I was like, first of all, that means you think I'm not right now, but also we don't have jobs. We're high school students. Like, so our parents, I guess you're talking about our family.
Mm-hmm.
And so, this was someone that I just, I could see that she couldn't imagine it in her life because I was Black and, she was, white. And it deeply hurt me because um, it it sort of like she wanted to keep this, class, this socioeconomic class hierarchy um, amongst us. And that made sense to her in her world. And I was thinking, she doesn't, she wouldn't be happy for me. She would be challenged by that. It made it easier for her to exist in the world if I, seemingly was, less economically successful than her. And that was so difficult to process and go through. And I think that was one of those moments where I thought, someone who knows me so well for all these years that I consider like a really good friend would have that view of me. And I thought, how deep racism goes that, she didn't even understand how offensive or, hard that statement was for me. And, we did talk about it afterwards. And, I don't think she fully really got why it was wrong. And so, I tried to be sort of kind and sort of explaining it to her, but it just never really sunk in. And I think that was one of those defining moments where I thought there are going to be limitations to how some people see me and perceive me, but I get that in a abstract sense. But for someone who I felt knew me, I think that was the difference. I think that was one of those moments where I thought it doesn't even matter that she knows me and she considers me a friend. I think that was one of those defining moments for sure.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, oh, I think it's hard because when we think about anything that's happening and when we see it from the distance, it's almost like it's not happening to me, right? We see
Mhm.
it, we feel as humans. But then when it's somebody who's close to you saying those things that we see, that we see on TV, that we see happening to other people, when it's somebody like, I can only imagine how hurtful it is, especially somebody you consider your friend.
Mhm.
So from that moment, did you have then different not the expectation, I don't think that that's the right word, how you chose your friend? Was it your approach, I guess, to friendship, was it different after that?
Absolutely. That's why I think it's one of those defining moments, is because it was always in my mind, like with those friendships, those conversations. Um, I did think of those things a little bit more. Normally, I wouldn't have, especially having friends outside of, well, there's aren't any Bajan Canadians, but, outside of, white presenting people, when I would have friends, and of course, I do because I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, but I would often have those conversations and things in my mind, or be a little hesitant to share a little bit more until I think I got to know them a little bit more. And saying things like, um, I talk about race a lot and talk about racism a lot. And, is that okay? And I think in one of my episodes, I talk about, one of the friends that I met through my work. And, she is, a white Canadian person. But, I said how I knew that I was going to really connect with her was because we were having this conversation and someone said something, in race. It wasn't even racist. He just sort of said like something about food and like how people should eat, their cultural foods. And then, before anything, my friend Shannon, she was like, I don't know, that sounds kind of racist. And, she said it in such a joking tone and she kept that way. But right there she was like, didn't even let the pause happen. And because people were like, oh, sort of uncomfortable, but she was right there in it. And I was like, I like Shannon. Just And so from there, I've known her for, it's about 8 years now. And so just from that one moment, I was like, the fact that she was willing to even say that, just out there, the burden wasn't on me to say anything. As a white presenting person, she understands that she has that power, that people will listen to her when she says it. And she was like, yeah, I talk about race all the time. And so we had this conversation. And so, I've shared with her the story that I shared about my friend, having that talk with me, and how afterwards, how she didn't really understand why it was so hurtful to me. And she was, just really like saying that she had her own journey of growth. And it's one of those things that, she's sort of done the work on her own and sort of coming up and having these conversations. So she was like, she'll get there. She's just taking a little bit longer. She's, having those doubts within herself. She's like, it's hard to confront those things
Mm.
inside you. So, yeah, I think I was hesitant, but something that I'm also working on is just, those being open and sharing and sort of, seeing where that goes and understanding again that it is a journey and growth. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that, yay to Shannon. Shout
Yeah.
out to Shannon. Oh my gosh, it's always great to find, to find great people who know that will stand up for you even when you're not in the room. And that was
Yeah.
something that you said in one of the episodes. I forgot which one, but you said that the white people have the power to say those things when Black people are not in the room. So I think that
Mhm.
that's the change that we as white people need to make. Um, Denise, it was such a pleasure talking with you today. I just like I said, I've listened to so many, and it's just like having to talk with you because I've listened to your voice for so long. So having you on was really good. So thank you for coming.
Oh, thank you so much. My genuine pleasure. It's always so lovely to speak with you. And I'm so happy that you invited me. And I know we were talking about possibly, connecting again, and you can join the Blacadian podcast because I really love those moments that define us. Like some of my favorite episodes was, you and Isabella just both talking through and, I think it's so important, those defining moments. And I was thinking about my defining moments through my life. And so it's such a special and important message that you have. And so thank you so much for inviting me. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you.
Of course, of course. Thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode. I will put the link to Blacadian Podcast on the show notes, and I will also post Black and Happy episode because it's one of my very, very favorite. And listen and learn because it's incredible. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you all next time.